Frank was used to the peaceful 2-hour ride home on his trusty motorcycle, a sleek machine that roared to life with a satisfying growl every time he turned the key. Tonight was no different. Clear skies and a cooling dusk accompanied him as the forest swallowed the last light of the day. His thoughts drifted lazily to the anime series he eagerly watched each evening, and before he realized it, he had forgotten to refuel his motorcycle before setting off. The fuel gauge flashed a warning, pulling him out of his daydreams. Panic nipped at him as he scanned the road for signs of a nearby station. Relief came quickly in the form of a green sign that pointed to a smaller road. Fuel station, 10 kilometers. He turned without hesitation, following the road's curve into deeper woods. After 20 minutes of driving, there was no sign of a gas station, but a new sign appeared. "Welcome to Astervalla." The motorcycle sputtered and slowed, its engine giving one final cough before it stopped entirely. Frank dismounted and sighed. He needed a plan. As he began walking, the crunch of leaves underfoot was joined by a sound from the bushes. Frank froze. From the shadows, an older man stepped forward, his face lined and his hair wild. "Hello there," the man said with an unsettling grin. "I'm Carl. Looks like you could use some help." Frank hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, when another man emerged silently from the trees. This one was larger, taller, and carried himself with an air of menace. "Haget," he said briefly, not offering a hand. Carl gestured for Frank to follow. "Astervalla isn't far. We'll get you sorted." The trio walked in silence, aside from Carl's rambling about Astervalla's history, how it was once a thriving settlement, now reduced to a strange, sleepy town. Frank and Haget exchanged exasperated glances and picked up their pace, eager to escape Carl's boring talk. Astervalla appeared out of the darkness, a collection of dimly lit buildings with an air of decay. Carl spread his arms wide. "Welcome to Astervalla, a great metropolis in the making," he said with a nervous laugh, as he led Frank to Gestus, the town's famous hotel and eatery. Inside, the place smelled of damp and disuse. The receptionist, an older man with a thick mustache, froze when he saw Frank, his eyes wide, as if he'd seen a ghost. Carl handed Frank a key with a grin and said, "Room 69, no charge. Here in Astervalla, we help lost souls." Frank entered the room, which was small and grimy, with peeling wallpaper and a mattress on the floor instead of a bed. Exhausted, he decided to ignore the discomfort and lay down to sleep. In the dead of night, the sound of a key in the lock jolted Frank awake. The door creaked open, and Carl stepped inside, his face twisted into a sinister expression. He held a leash and collar in his hands. "You're mine now," Carl growled, advancing toward Frank. Frank tried to fight back, but Carl was strong and relentless. A syringe appeared in Carl's hand, and Frank barely had time to scream before everything went black. When Frank awoke, he found himself locked in a cage in Carl's kitchen. The room smelled of rot and stale air. Outside, a crowd of men gathered, their faces pressed against the window. They were a grotesque mix of old and eager, their eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. Among them was Haget, who nodded smugly when asked if Frank was inside. Carl pulled the curtains shut and ignored the demands of the crowd. "He's mine," he muttered under his breath. The next morning, Carl stepped outside, only to be confronted by Elanders, the town's ancient and respected leader. Elanders demanded Frank, referring to him as the Golden One. Carl denied everything, but Elanders wasn't fooled. With a wave of his hand, He ordered the crowd to storm the house. They found Frank caged like an animal. The men broke the cage open, and what followed was unspeakable. Elanders stepped in to claim Frank, declaring, "The Golden One is mine." The townsfolk watched in silent awe as Elanders took Frank away, like a dog and his owner. They walked away. Years passed, and Frank remained a mystery. His disappearance left his family devastated, and the town of Astervalla puzzled. Rumors swirled, but no one truly knew what had become of him. Life moved on, as it always does, and the town's elderly leader, Mr. Elanders, grew frail with age. When Elanders finally passed away, it was as if the soul of the town left with him. The priest, Carl, quickly took on the role of leader, a transition met with little resistance. However, it wasn't long before Carl's newfound authority unearthed a shocking revelation. Frank, long thought to be lost, was found chained in the basement of Elanders' house. Weak and barely alive, Frank's discovery sent shockwaves through the town. But rather than freeing him, Carl took Frank into his own care. Soon, whispers spread. People suspected Carl was hiding Frank in his own basement. Why was Frank so important? To some, he was merely an unfamiliar face who arrived years ago. To others, he was the Golden One, a key to something profound. Eternal life, perhaps. Time passed, and Astervalla welcomed a new visitor. His name was Paul. Paul was a man on a mission, or so he pretended. A short, overweight man with a loud mouth and an overinflated ego. He claimed to study medicine. In truth, Paul was more interested in the illusion of success than the hard work it demanded. Driving through the countryside one late evening, his car sputtered to a halt. Low on fuel, Paul stumbled upon Astervalla, a town not marked on any map. Searching for a gas station, he stepped out of his car and called out into the stillness. "Hey, anyone here?" Paul's voice echoed through the empty streets. From behind a tree came a low whisper. "Psst, you over here." Paul turned to see a man with a long brown beard and unkempt hair, draped in a green trench coat. "Who are you?" Paul asked. "I'm Jesus," the man replied with utter seriousness. Paul laughed nervously. "You're definitely not Jesus." The strange man ignored Paul's remark. "There are no gas stations here. It's all lies. Go to Gestus, the hotel, get some sleep, but trust no one," the man said. With that cryptic warning, the man disappeared back into the shadows. With no other options, Paul headed to Gestus, the only hotel in the town. The reception area was dimly lit and eerily quiet. "Hello?" Paul called out. A man with a thick mustache popped up from behind the desk. "I'm Dad. Just call me Mr. Dad," he said, in a hurried tone. Paul blinked. "You're Mr. Dad?" "Yes." "Hotel keeper, receptionist, police officer, handyman, you name it. Want a room or not?" Paul, too exhausted, just nodded. Mr. Dad handed him a key. "Room 3590. It's free for you." Confused by the strange numbering, Paul shrugged and made his way to the room. It was sparse, with an old 1980s television and little else. When he turned on the TV, it displayed a live feed of a street in Astervalla. "That's weird," Paul muttered, switching it off. He lay down on the stiff bed, but sleep didn't come easily. All night, strange noises echoed in the corridors, furniture moving, footsteps pacing, and muffled voices. Morning came, though Paul felt like he hadn't slept at all. Groggy and irritated, he stumbled back to the reception area, where he found Mr. Dad speaking with an older man. "Welcome to Astervalla," the man said with a wide grin. "I'm Carl, the town's mayor, priest, and leader." Paul introduced himself briefly and asked about gas for his car. "Don't worry," Carl replied. "We'll sort that out. But first, eat. Breakfast is served in the dining hall, just to the left." Before heading to eat, Paul turned to Mr. Dad. "Hey, about those noises last night. What was going on?" Mr. Dad glanced nervously at Carl before stammering, I was just doing work. Go eat." Paul hesitated, feeling something was wrong, but hunger took over, and he headed to the dining hall. Paul wiped his mouth with a napkin, chewing potato. That was the only food that he was offered, boiled potatoes. He glanced at the photos on the wall. There was a man on almost every photo, a man with a gray coat and gray hat, with black round sunglasses. The man in the gray coat seemed to stare back, even through the dark sunglasses. It gave Paul an uncomfortable feeling, like the room itself was watching him. The heavy wooden door to the dining hall creaked open, and Carl burst in. His footsteps were heavy, and his wide smile stretched unnaturally across his face. "Paul, my friend," Carl said loudly, clapping his hands together. "How are you finding our wonderful dining hall? Isn't it just magnificent?" Paul looked around. The room was plain, with high ceilings, plain wooden tables, and a single dim chandelier that flickered occasionally. He raised an eyebrow at Carl. "It's big," Paul said slowly. "But the food, it's just potatoes." Carl tilted his head, his expression faltering for a moment before the smile returned. "Ah, yes, the finest potatoes from Astervalla's fields. No other town grows them like we do." Paul stabbed another piece of potato with his fork. "If you say so," he muttered. Carl's attention shifted, and he followed Paul's gaze to the photos on the walls. His smile grew even wider, which Paul didn't think was possible. "Ah, you've noticed him. Elanders," Carl exclaimed, gesturing toward the largest photo. Paul nodded slowly. "Yeah, who is he? Looks like some kind of local legend." Carl's eyes lit up. "Not just a legend, my friend. Elanders was the heart of Astervalla. He has guided this town for decades, no centuries. A man of vision, of wisdom. He is eternal, as the photo says." Paul frowned. "Eternal, like immortal." Carl chuckled but didn't answer directly. "Elanders was special." And then Carl changed in a short second into a dark, jealous voice and said, "But that old sack of balls is dead now. I am the legend, the real leader." Carl stared at him with a blank expression for a moment before finally speaking again. "Tonight will be a special night," he said. "There's going to be a show here at the hotel, in the showroom, and I'd like to invite you to come." Paul felt his unease grow. He put down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "What kind of show is it?" Paul asked. Paul shook his head. "I can't stay another night. I need petrol so I can drive home." Carl laughed, a strange, almost unsettling laugh. "Petrol only arrives once a month in this town, and right now, we're all out." "When will it arrive this month?" Paul asked eagerly. Carl's cheerful reply made Paul's stomach sink. "This Sunday, and today's Monday, so you've got a whole week to stay here. Don't worry, you'll enjoy your time in Astervalla. I'll make sure of it. Plus, you're staying at the Guesters Hotel for free, with complimentary meals." Paul's initial resistance softened as he calculated his options. "All right, I guess I can stay for a week." Then a thought struck him. "Do you have a phone I can use? My smartphone's dead, and charging it isn't working. Once again, Carl gave him that blank stare, as if lost in thought, before snapping back into his cheerful demeanor. Oh yes, a phone. Of course we have one, at the reception. Just ask the receptionist to make a call. You mean Mr. Dad? Paul asked, raising an eyebrow. Carl hesitated briefly. Oh yes, Mr. Dad. Ask him. With the conversation over, Paul finished his meal and headed back to his room, feeling a growing sense of unease about this peculiar town. Later that evening, Paul was in his room waiting for the show. He had nothing else to do than wait. The television was boring with that live stream of some street in Astervalla. The weather outside was gray and cold, empty streets. Like this town is a ghost town. At least 1,000 people could live here. So far, he has only met one person on the street. The man with long beard and green coat. The man that warned him about this place. While Paul waited to be called to the night show, he was thinking about this strange, eerie place. Time passed and no knocking on the door. It became really late. Still nothing. Paul started to think that maybe the show was cancelled and started to plan to go to sleep. As Paul was reading himself to sleep, a loud banging was heard from his door. He hurried to open the door, and there stood Mr. Dad. Mr. Dad looked disappointed and said, "Why aren't you opening the door? I banged on the door for too long." On that, Paul replied, "Mate, you banged on the door for only 5 seconds." Mr. Dad's expression changed to doubtful and said, "Show will start in 10 minutes. Come down now." "Where is it?" asked Paul. "Come to reception and he'll bring you to the showroom," said Mr. Dad with a quick voice. Then he left quickly. The time was now 1 a.m. Paul left his room and headed to the reception. This night felt different. The hotel didn't sound so dead like it usually does. While at the reception, conversation voices could be heard, like small crowd. At the reception, Mr. Dad waited for him. "You are late," said Mr. Dad, with an annoyed voice. "How can I be late when it took me 2 minutes to get here?" asked Paul. Mr. Dad looked at him and just said, "Follow me." He took him to a long corridor. It was a poorly lighted corridor full of photos. Guess who was on the photos? Elanders. At the end of the corridor, there was a red wooden door. The closer they got to the door, the louder conversation voices became. When they reached the door, Mr. Dad looked at Paul and said very loud, "Get in!" Then opened the door and pushed him in, closing the door behind him with a loud bang. When Paul entered the theater, the room fell instantly silent. The chatter of the crowd ceased, and every pair of eyes turned toward him, filled with suspicion. Whispers slithered through the air as Paul walked carefully to find a seat, the weight of their stares pressing down on him. The theater was old, its walls draped in darkness. A dim, flickering light illuminated the stage, casting eerie shadows across the decayed wood. The scent of old socks and sweat lingered in the air, thick and nauseating. As Paul settled into his seat, the murmur of the crowd resumed, hushed but constant. 5 minutes passed, then 10, 20, 40. Still the show did not begin. The restless tension grew unbearable. Turning to his nearest neighbor, Paul hesitated before asking, "Why hasn't it started yet?" The man beside him snapped his head around, his face twisted in anger. "Quit asking. The show will start when it's time." Paul shrank back, unsettled by the man's harsh response. He decided not to ask again. Instead, he waited. Then, almost 40 minutes later, a frustrated voice erupted from the audience. "Start the damn show." Like an ignition, the crowd erupted into a chant. "Start the show. We want it. We want it." At that moment, a man emerged from behind the stage curtain. He was dressed only in a shirt and underwear, his presence both absurd and unsettling. "Please, my good people," he called, raising his hands to quiet them. "Calm down. The show will start now." Preparations took time. But the crowd was not appeased. Their chants grew louder. "We want the show." With a dramatic flourish, the man bellowed, "The show starts now." Then he turned and vanished backstage. Silence fell once more. Then from the darkness, a large man stepped onto the stage. He was clad in a short skirt and high heels, devil horns perched upon his head. With a grotesque grace, he began to dance, his heels pounding against the wooden floor. Paul's breath hitched. He recognized the man. It was Haggett. Paul's stomach twisted. The sight was bizarre, yet undeniably amusing. He grinned despite himself, but when he glanced around, he noticed the audience wore no such expressions. Their faces remained eerily serious. Then, a small man waddled onto the stage, dragging behind him an enormous plastic vagina, tall as a standing man. With reverence, he handed Haggett the spear. Without hesitation, Haggett began stabbing the plastic figure with exaggerated ferocity. The audience responded in a low, droning chant. "Kill Brit! Kill her! Kill it!" Paul was bewildered. He giggled nervously. "What the hell is this?" he thought. The scene continued, the stabbing relentless. The chanting, though subdued, grew increasingly hostile. The air thickened, not just with tension, but with a new, putrid scent. The smell of human flatulence. The audience was farting in their fervor, as if their anger expelled itself through their very bodies. At last, with one final thrust, the plastic vagina collapsed onto the stage floor. The crowd erupted, leaping to their feet in thunderous applause. "It's dead! Britta is dead!" they howled in delight. Haggett wasted no time. He seized the fallen prop and hurried off stage. The theater returned to silence, but an eerie anticipation clung to the air. Paul sensed something was wrong. Then, in near-perfect unison, the audience members began removing their pants. Their eyes remained fixed on the stage. A voice rang out. "It's happening. It's now. Enjoy it, people." Slowly, a metal cage descended from above. A pulsing techno beat began to play, growing louder as the cage neared the floor. The audience reacted viscerally, moaning and growling in time with the music. Their bodies trembled, consumed by some unknown ecstasy. Paul sat frozen in his seat, fear creeping into his bones. What was this? A ritual? A sect gathering? And what, if anything, was inside that cage? He needed to leave. Now, just as he resolved to move, the crowd surged forward, flooding the stage. They formed a circle around the cage, swaying in a slow, hypnotic dance. Paul's heart pounded. He had to escape. He scanned the room for an exit, and as discreetly as possible, began to slip away. The chanting grew louder. Golden One. Paul reached the corridor. The cries of Golden One chased him as he bolted through the theater's winding halls. The techno beat throbbed behind him, distorted by the echoes of unearthly moans. At last he burst into the reception area, empty. Mr. Dad was nowhere in sight. Paul raced to his room, gasping for breath. "I'm leaving," he muttered to himself, his hands trembling. Then he noticed something. The TV was on. The screen displayed a grainy live feed of the theater. The same stage, the same people, but no sound. Paul squinted. Even through the poor resolution, he could tell what was happening. An orgy. Figures moved in a chaotic, primal rhythm. Some had entered the cage. Paul recoiled, his stomach churning with dread. This was beyond strange. It was horrific. He had no choice. He had to leave the town. His car was out of fuel, but he'd walk if he had to. Throwing his things together, he fled the hotel. The streets were eerily silent. He took the main road out of town, but before he could make it far, a voice rang out behind him. "Hey, you didn't leave the room key, you thief!" Paul turned. Mr. Dad stood in the doorway, eyes blazing with fury. "I forgot. Here, take it," Paul shouted, tossing the key toward him. It didn't help. Mr. Dad pulled out a small axe. "Thief!" he bellowed, charging toward Paul. Paul ran. He ran until the lights of Astervalla disappeared behind him, until his lungs burned, until the night swallowed him whole. By morning he had reached an old highway. Relief washed over him as he saw a road sign ahead. Astervalla. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Paul pressed on. By lunchtime he reached the town. It was eerily empty. Not a soul in sight. As he wandered through the streets, a door creaked open beside him. A man stepped out. "Are you lost, young man?" Paul hesitated. "No, mate. Just looking for a way home." The man smiled. "Name's Roger." Roger began speaking of Astervalla, boasting about its significance. Then his tone darkened as he mentioned Astervalla. "A shit place full of arrogant fools, and their priest, an incompetent bastard." Paul hesitated. "I just came from Astervalla." Roger's expression changed in an instant. His smile vanished. His eyes darkened. "Astervalla, you filth." With that, Roger slammed the door in Paul's face. Confused and unsettled, Paul wandered further into town. He reached a hotel. Its name, simply, Hotel. As he stepped inside, a group of men turned toward him in unison, as if they had been expecting him. A voice from outside shattered the silence. "It's an Astervalla whore. Take him, boys!" The men lunged. Cold steel snapped around Paul's wrists. He thrashed, screaming, and then Paul was gone. 2 missing people, 2 neighboring towns. What happened? We may never know. But if you ever find yourself low on fuel and stranded in a strange town, remember Astervalla.